Welcome to the Institutional Review Board for the Social and Behavioral Sciences. We're going to talk about the use of verbal consent in research. Verbal consent is the informed consent process when a researcher receives verbal confirmation from an individual that they agree to participate in a study without a written signature on a consent form. Most researchers are aware of the section of the federal regulations for the protection of human research subjects that states informed consent shall be documented by the use of a written informed consent form approved by the IRB and signed by the subject. So frequently when researchers find out that verbal consent exists for human subject research studies, the first thing they do is contact the IRB and say, "Hi, how can I get this for my study?" An IRB may waive the requirement to obtain a signed consent form in certain situations. If the consent form is the only record linking the participant to the study, and the main risk to the participant is a loss of confidentiality. Examples of this type of study would be drug abuse studies or domestic abuse studies. The most common type of situation when signature can be waived is when the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects and involves no procedures for which written consent is normally required outside of the research context. Finally, the requirement for signature could be waived in situations where participants are from a cultural group or community where signing forms is not the norm. For these types of studies, the research procedure should be minimal risk and an alternative plan should be in place to document consent. So if you'd like to use verbal consent for your study, the first thing you want to do is to include in your study protocol that you plan to use verbal consent. That way, the IRB can review your plan and approve it. When describing your plan to use verbal consent in your protocol, you'll want to include how you will ensure that participants are fully informed. It's important to note that in situations where the signature requirement has been waived, the researcher should still provide the participant with a written statement about the research. One way to do this is to send potential participants the study information sheet before you have the consent discussion with them. This document is also sometimes called a consent without signature. Sending this form ahead of time provides potential participants with time to consider the study and an opportunity to ask the study team questions about the research before they give their voluntary agreement to participate. Alternatively, the study's information sheet could be posted on a website so that potential participants will have an opportunity to review the form on demand. What we don't want is for participants to feel surprised or upset about something that they didn't understand when they were agreeing to take part in the study. Giving potential participants the information sheet helps them to understand what they're agreeing to for the study, and it helps to ensure that the participants have the contact information for the study team if they need it in the future. For some types of studies, it may be appropriate to have an entirely verbal consent process. For example, maybe the study is conducted entirely over the phone. For studies like this, the study team should prepare and obtain IRB approval for a consent script that includes all necessary elements and is written in clear, non-technical language. Studies that use an entirely verbal consent process place more burden for documentation on the study team. In these situations, the researchers should document the verbal consent process in the participants' study records. In this note, you should record the date, time, and location that the consent process took place. You should also include that the participant had an opportunity to ask questions and demonstrated understanding of the study before they provided their verbal consent. Finally, include the name and signature of the study team member that obtained verbal consent from the participant. It's also possible to pair verbal consent with another consent process. Consent is an ongoing process, and it's good practice for the study team to check in with a research participant before each study visit to answer any questions and to confirm the participant's ongoing agreement to be in the study. For example, including an abbreviated verbal consent step prior to an interview shows the researcher respects the participant's ongoing decision and helps to build a relationship of trust. Key things to remember if you're using the verbal consent process are to ensure that participants are fully informed during the consent discussion, and that they have had an opportunity to ask questions, and that they've had sufficient time to consider the study before they provide their voluntary agreement to participate. If you'd like to learn more about verbal consent or ways that you can waive signature on the consent form, please reach out to us. We're here to help you.